The LA Kings make changes, but are they better? The Montreal Canadiens continue to add young talent, while the Minnesota Wild make a big contract extension. But what are the keys to their improvement? We've got all this and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. With the playoffs in our rearview mirror in the NHL and NBA, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On LA Kings, Eddie Garcia. And Eddie, it hasn't been a dull offseason for the LA Kings. A lot of movement, but overall, how do you assess the moves that this team has made, and made one as recently as late last week?
I would say that the offseason for the Kings has been pretty underwhelming. General manager Rob Blake continues his up and down tenure as the man in charge of this team. There are a lot of people calling for his head. They were calling for it, for there to be a change at the end of the season. That did not happen. He's going into the final year of his contract. If you're looking at the hottest hot seats of general managers around the league, I would think Rob Blake would be at the top of that list. I know Steve Yzerman in Detroit might get more publicity, if you will, because look, they're both Hall of Famers. They're both running the teams that they had their best success with. But Steve Yzerman's won a cup and put a cup team together elsewhere, and now he's in Detroit trying to rebuild things. And I know that the patience is running out, but I think the patience already run out with the Kings, to be honest with you. So the offseason for the Kings, though, has been, again, underwhelming. They lose a defenseman in Matt Roy for absolutely nothing as a UFA. Victor Arvidsson has moved on, and he went to a division rival in Edmonton, who's beaten the Kings 3 years in a row in the playoffs. But there were some good things. Quentin Byfield, the young the young center for the Kings, the young forward, he signs a really nice deal, 5 years, $5.25 million per year. A lot of people thought that was a very good deal. I didn't go all in on the 8 years yet, right? But it didn't do a bridge deal necessarily. They kind of met in the middle. I think a lot of people like that deal. Brought in a few guys. Warren Fogle comes over from Edmonton, Joel Edmondson from St. Louis. And then you've got Tanner Jeannot in a draft day trade from Tampa Bay. I think a very mixed bag on those guys. I think Fogle's a nice blue collar kind of a guy, but probably a third line guy. He might play on the second line with the Kings. Joel Edmondson, I thought the term and the contract for him were really bad. He gets a 4-year deal. He's going to make $3.85 million a year for a 31-year-old defenseman who's going to be a third pairing guy. I don't understand the term and the investment in somebody like that. And Tanner Jeannot, right? He had their great rookie year in Nashville. He's a big, strong, tough guy. And I think the Kings want to get more blue collar and be tougher. And I understand the reasoning behind that, but is that enough to offset the losses they had and to make them better? Of course, there was the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade, which felt like an addition by subtraction in some ways, but the whole deal, giving up the assets they did to Winnipeg to bring him in and then have to hit the eject button, and you get Darcy Kuemper in net, who's won a Stanley Cup but hasn't been very good in Washington the last couple of seasons. So I would say, looking at the moves made in the offseason, it's hard to make a case the Kings are better now than they were at this time last year.
3 years in a row, the Kings have been eliminated by Edmonton in the playoffs. What is the big obstacle facing this team to get over that hump?
Well, Edmonton's obviously very good. And I think sometimes we look at it that way, and I understand it. And I'm not saying that's not the right question, but I think you do have to give credit to the Oilers. Maybe the Kings have a better fate if they had a better matchup, but that's the way the NHL playoff system is the way it is, and the Kings have to deal with it. So certainly special teams were huge in the playoffs this year. The Oilers, not only their power play, but their penalty kill shut down the Kings power play completely. The special teams were so lopsided that was really the key. So the Kings getting better on special teams certainly could be a part of that. I think though for the Kings, they're looking at going with a lot of their homegrown talent and hoping those guys can step forward and at least make up for the production they lost in the offseason, which I think they can. But Quinton Byfield, I mentioned him earlier, had a breakout year last year, scoring 20 goals and just eclipsing all of his previous career highs dramatically in goals and assists and points. It looks like they're going to move him back to his natural position of center. He had been playing on the wing on the top line. So that's going to be a big move for him. I know he's very excited about that. But they have a lot of young guys. Another former first-round pick in Alex Turcotte is a guy who's had a lot of injury issues. He finally was healthy last year. He got a taste of the NHL and looked pretty good. Looks like he's going to get a full-time role this year. Another young player is Akil Thomas, a former second-round pick. Looks like he's going to get a full-time role this year. Got a little taste last season. So there's some younger guys. Also, I should mention defenseman Brant Clark, another former first-round pick. He had a great year in the AHL last year, his first full pro season. He's had a cup of coffee with the Kings here and there. He's going to come in and get a full-time role on the blue line. Not sure if it's going to be second pairing or third pairing, but very excited about him. He's the most dynamic offensive defenseman the Kings have had since they drafted Drew Doughty. So there are a lot of young players that are question marks. They're going to get their chance. I'm sure they're going to be young and they're going to be hungry to prove and get their opportunity to see what they can do with it. So the Kings are kind of going in on some younger guys and hoping that they can come in and provide a lot of energy and excitement as well.
How confident are you with the goaltending situation as it stands right now?
Not real confident, to be honest with you. That said, a lot of people weren't confident in Cam Talbot last year when they brought him in. His season before in Ottawa was not good, and he completely turned it around, was an all-star, did slump in the second half and did get replaced in the playoffs. So it didn't completely work out. I think, had it been maybe a full season and had they advanced in the playoffs, I think he's brought back for another year, but that didn't happen. Darcy Kuemper was the price they paid to get rid of Pierre-Luc Dubois and not retain any of his contract. The Capitals wanted to get rid of Darcy Kuemper now that they've got Charlie Lindgren, and the Kings were willing to take on the rest of his contract. He's making, I believe, just short of $5 million a year. So it's not nothing. It's for a guy who's lost his starting job last year and has struggled the last 2 years. But then 3 years ago, he did have the cup run in Colorado. I know people will say that was a stacked team. Lots of goalies could have won a cup with that team. Well, he did. So the Kings, I think, are a better defensive team than the Capitals. So I think Kuemper can bounce back, and I think he can be good enough. And that's kind of where the Kings are right now. The last few years, they're just looking for goalies that are good enough. Not a goaltender that's going to be the reason why you win, but a goalie you can win with. So I think they feel like he can be another Cam Talbot that with a better defensive team around him. And he was briefly in Los Angeles and had a great run here many years ago before the Kings traded him to Arizona. So I think cautiously optimistic would be what I would say for Darcy Kuemper.
You mentioned Rob Blake being on the hot seat. What will it take for him to get another contract with the LA Kings at the end of this season?
That's a very good question. And it's an interesting position that Kings fans have been put in, because I think there's a significant group of fans that would like to see a change. And yet, what are you going to do? Root against the Kings to lose? So that happens. Obviously, you don't want to do that. If the Kings can get back in the playoffs, I would say they're a bubble team. But if they can get back in the playoffs, and if they can finally get out of the first round, which they haven't done 3 years in a row, and their last 4 trips to the postseason, all first-round exits, that might be enough to get him an extension. I would be surprised if that happens. I really think they should have made the move to bring in another GM at the end of the season. He's a lame duck GM and isn't in a great position. If all the young guys play really well, if Darcy Kuemper bounces back, if Quinton Byfield moves to center and suddenly that three-headed monster the Kings thought they were going to have with Pierre-Luc Dubois, with Kopitar and Byfield and Philip Deneau down the middle suddenly becomes what they thought they were going to have last year, then maybe it all works out and maybe they extend him for a couple more years. I don't know, but it's a very interesting position to kind of be in, because it seems like the Kings are regressing. They were moving in a very positive direction, got in the playoffs 3 years ago, 7 games with the Oilers. But since then, it seems like they took a little bit of a step back last year, even though they had a good regular season. And then I don't know. It doesn't seem like things are moving in the right direction. It's been 8 years of Rob Blake and no playoff wins. That speaks pretty loud.
All right. Well, I know, Eddie, you'll cover that every step of the way this season and beyond. Why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
We are Locked On LA Kings. Please don't search Locked On Kings, because you'll get a certain Sacramento basketball team if you do. So make sure you search for Locked On LA Kings wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. And if you want to follow me, I'm Eddie on Fox on X and Twitter.
All right, Eddie.
Did I say that right? I think I did. Yeah.
I think you did. Eddie, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
All right, Gil. Thank you.
Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Canadiens, Laura Saba. And Laura, anything but dull this offseason in Montreal. Let's start with the draft, because I know you're super excited about that. 2 first-round picks. What excites you most about this draft?
I think the Canadiens knocked the first round out of the park. They did get some help, and we have to admit that, because a player like Ivan Demidov, we're still pinching ourselves. We're still, we're still wondering how this player was still available at 5th overall. Obviously, we got some luck in that the Columbus Blue Jackets refused to make a trade for other teams that may have wanted Demidov, even though they were pretty clear on the fact that they wanted Caden Lindstrom. They had their man, and they helped us out a lot with that. And obviously with Anaheim picking Beckett Seneca, most memorable moment, right? So, and the other thing too was that Chicago had fallen in love with a different Russian player, and because it would have made sense to, just imagine Demidov and Bedard together, right? It would have made so much sense. So we did get very, very lucky. And I would say that the Canadiens, the more skill part, the luck part was Demidov, and absolutely. Just with that, if they had bombed every other pick, I think Montreal Canadiens fans would have been happy. He is a player with a tremendous amount of upside. He's got so much skill. There's so much excitement. There's so much excitement to his game, creativity to his game. This kid is going to be, as many public scouts have predicted, he could be the top scorer in the Canadiens within, 5 to 6 years, right? So Demidov is really the big name, but that second pick that they made, they did move up to get Michael Hage, and that, I think, people said that, oh, he's not a steal because the Canadiens still had to give up assets to get him. And I don't see it that way, because the fact that he was available there still at 21st is, it's very, very, very encouraging, because a lot of scouts had him at top 15 in their draft boards. And this is a player, I think the exciting part is not the fact that, he grew up a Montreal Canadiens fan. That's the emotional part. That's the part that drew us in, right? He's a player that he overcame He didn't really. I think he's still going through it. He lost his father the previous summer, and there's a lot that goes with that. But for him to be able to perform well enough to be drafted afterwards, like that's somebody who has a determination. And I think what he brings to the game is a level of, I think, intelligence that the Canadiens need, and it's something that is quite underrated. But if you look at the Canadiens organization, like there's a lot of hockey sense that they look for. There's a lot of intelligence that they look for. So that in itself was fantastic. And then admittedly, most Canadiens fans didn't know a whole lot about the players that came after. The emotional pick of picking Atos Koivu, I think that was another thing. That was purely for the fans, right? They could have picked anyone there, and there might have been players that were better, or like there were more of the best player available at the time. But the thing with Atos Koivu is that he's not a slouch. He definitely, like a lot of scouts will say, we haven't even seen him scratch the surface of his potential just yet. He's still growing into his body, let alone growing into his game. So it's not like they wasted a pick, right? It's not like that. And so there was that as well. So like the Canadiens really pandered to their fans, I think. In this past draft. And then there's a lot of questions about some of the other players that they have. But I think the biggest thing was those three picks made the most noise for good reason.
No doubt. And then some big re-signings also over the course of this offseason, including in the last week or so. Why don't you fill us in on the impact of those?
Kent Hughes is now doing his homework. He took some time off. He was very quiet, but now he's going through the to-do list. So the first thing that we heard about was Arbor Jackie's contract. And he and Justin Barron were two of the RFAs that they had chosen to qualify. They did not qualify the others, but that doesn't mean that's the end of the road for them. But really for the Montreal Canadiens, it was most important to get Arbor Jackie out of all of those signed to a contract. Very, very economical contract, $1.3 million. And, the fact that the player is an RFA at this point, doesn't have leverage at this point, is kind of a moot point. Like, I think what the Canadiens have always had in Arbor Jackie being an undrafted is that he is a player that provides a lot of value for what he costs, right? They got him for free essentially, and for this kind of money. And he's a player that a lot of GMs covet. And so that his stock is always going to be high, even if the contract doesn't necessarily reflect that. And I think, in our episode today, we were saying that's coming out today, we were saying that Arbor Jackie provides to the Montreal Canadiens a value that were he on any other team, he might not necessarily provide that same level. And so he's such an important player. That was the first one. And then it was Justin Barron, which was $1.15 million for 2 years. And that was a little bit less. And I think for Justin Barron, the biggest thing this year is he has to prove himself this year, because he has so much inconsistency. He has stretches where he seems like he doesn't belong in the NHL. And then he has stretches where it seems like, this was worth giving up Arturi Lehkonen for. That's who they traded him for. So this year is really his opportunity to prove he has a place in the Montreal Canadiens future, because if not, he's definitely one of the odd ones out. The Canadiens have so many defensemen. There's so many of them. Some of these guys are not going to be around when the Habs are good. So Justin Barron, I think this year is his opportunity. It is a 2-year contract, but he could get traded in the middle of that. So those were big signings. And then obviously the biggest one this past week was signing Caden Gooley to an extension. It was very interesting because they signed him to a 5-year extension. He wanted 8 years, and they didn't want that. And they flatly refused. He ended up agreeing to 5 years. But I think in the long run, that's better for him as well. For the Montreal Canadiens, this gives them an opportunity to see if he's worth more than that, if he's worth that big contract. And for him, the contract ends when he's still in his prime. So he has the opportunity to really cash in. It could be the kind of thing where it's like, well, I was cheap for this long and now it's time to pay me and I still have some good years left. So I think it ended up benefiting both, because if he had gone for 8 years at maybe $7 or $8 million as opposed to the 5.5, I think, if there came a time where he wasn't worth that $7 or $8 million, where he didn't pan out the way everyone expects, then it would be an overpay. It would be, this would be following him around wherever he went. There would be a lot of weight to that contract. Whereas this way, it's, he has the opportunity to prove himself. He's still getting paid a significant amount, but he's got the opportunity to say, you know what, I've been your number one defenseman or your number two defenseman. Now it's time to pay me that kind of money, and he'll still be worth it, as opposed to a Brendan Gallagher, for example, who got paid for his past contributions, not for his future contributions.
Right, and then as the cap goes up, his next contract, if he plays well, will go up as well. So you got all these young players. You've accumulated a lot of picks, a lot of prospects. As you said, too many defensemen to even have all of them make the team. What is the timetable for this team to contend for a playoff spot?
So a lot of fans want to see it this year, this upcoming season. I think that's a long shot, but I think this upcoming season, they can no longer be content with finishing with a top 10 pick. They are unfortunately going to have to embrace that no man's land where you don't make the playoffs and you also don't get a top pick, but they have to be doing everything they can and fighting tooth and nail to get that wild card spot. Because to me, this is the opportunity for all those players we just mentioned to play lights out, be the best they can be, and for the Canadiens to be really able to gauge what they have in the pipeline. I think they should not accept anything less than that. It sucks for the fans, but for them, they have to take massive steps forward. So I think this upcoming year is not it, but the season after, like, not making the playoffs will be a disappointment. If you're going to talk about, like, you know, when are they going to be a Stanley Cup contender and when are they going to be a threat where other teams might not want to play them, I think we're maybe about 4 or 5 years from that. Definitely not sooner than that. But, you know, if in the summer of 2026 they have not made the playoffs, or spring of 2026 they've not made the playoffs, then something went wrong.
All right. Well, Laura, I know you will have this covered every step of the way. Why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast, where they could find you and your new co-host on social media?
I do. I have a wonderful new co-host, Ian Boisvert. You can find him on social media at Maybe It's Ian. Our podcast is called Locked On Canadiens, and we are wherever you get this podcast, on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and we're free and available on social media. I'm at The Active Stick, and our show is at LO_Canadiens. Thank you so much, Gil.
Thank you, Laura. Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much I never want them to stop. But with the Stanley Cup playoffs and the NBA playoffs in our rearview mirror, there are just fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Certainly, Major League Baseball in full swing now as we race toward the playoffs. You've got the summer games in Paris. And how about football futures and hockey futures? Lots to check out on FanDuel. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel.com, FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Wild and a familiar face to Locked On NHL viewers, Seth Tuple. And Seth, been a pretty busy couple of weeks for the Wild lately.
Yeah, it's amazing how much they've done with how little they've had access to. Like, we knew going into the offseason, it was going to be tricky to make a ton of big moves. We figured they maybe had enough room to lock in maybe one guy for sure. And we knew that there was going to be a big extension looming. And so it's like Bill Guerin just saw the checklist and was like, okay, check. And now we're just kind of hanging out until preseason gets going and we get a little better idea of who's in and who's out.
So the big extension, Brock Faber, were you surprised at the numbers, the term, the dollar amounts, and do you think it was a good deal for the Wild?
I surprisingly actually thought it was going to be a higher AAV than he ended up getting, which is crazy to say about an $8.5 million AAV deal. But the thing about Brock Faber that I think is most impressive is how quickly he takes to different things on the ice. He came in and he was already a good defenseman, but he added a lot to his offense over the course of the season. He never ran the power play with the Gophers. He did that with the Minnesota Wild. So he was learning on the fly, and he did a pretty darn good job of it. And not only that, but just the number of things that he was responsible for with the Minnesota Wild, having to be the number one defenseman for a good portion of the year due to injuries to Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin, playing on the power play, playing on the penalty kill, being the key guy in late stage moments in overtime, you name it. Brock Faber did it. He had a stretch of, I think, 4 or 5 straight games where he was 25 plus minutes a night, including a couple of 30-minute per night performances. He was 5th in the NHL in total time on ice. Oh, and he played the entire final 2 months of the season with broken ribs, and nobody knew about it until after the season was done. He didn't even mention it because to him, he was going to do whatever it took to be out there on the ice to help get his team in position for a potential playoff spot. And I shudder to think about where the Minnesota Wild would have been had he not come in and been able to be a calming, dependable presence on the back end. Oh, and then he nearly had a 50-point season, which would have been the second time it's been done by a Minnesota Wild defenseman. Ryan Suter's the only other one to do that. And so he accomplished all these different things as a rookie. And so you look at that 8-year deal, it's perfect because he's 21 years old. And so this will take up, the hope is with defensemen that in that 28, 29 year range is when you kind of start to hit your peak. And so he'll still be in his peak, assuming everything goes well with injuries throughout this contract. But if you look at where he's at right now, he's playing at about a $7.5 to $8 million per year defenseman right now. If he continues to improve and escalate, especially on the offensive end, then all of a sudden you're looking at a guy who is a double-digit AAV defenseman, no problem. And this ends up looking like a bargain. And this follows a pattern that the Minnesota Wild have done with the last few big extensions they've signed. Matt Boldy got that 7x7, and 1 year into that, he looks like that's going to be a huge bargain. Joel Eriksson Ek signed an 8-year deal worth just over $5 million per season. He's a few years into that deal. That looks like a massive steal. And so the Wild like to do this. They like to sign the big deals early. And yeah, you may pay a little bit more on the front end, but the hope is that with all these, they end up being huge bargains at the end of midway through to the end of the deal. And it doesn't look like that's going to be an issue with Brock Faber at all.
Talk to me about some of the other moves that were made. I know they're not as monumental as Faber, but still important.
Well, Bill Guerin identified the need to get back to the identity this offseason. And we had kind of thought, those that cover the Minnesota Wild had thought that, maybe you go and try to get somebody on the second line to help with the scoring. But Bill Guerin went out. He identified the identity and the penalty kill as 2 huge areas of concern. And he's not wrong. He's not wrong. After guys like Pat Maroon and Brandon Duhaime were traded last year, the Wild were pushed around quite a bit down the stretch. And so there was definitely a need to go get some punch, to go get some bite. You go get Yakov Trenin and sign him to a 4-year deal. Maybe a year too much for my tastes, but he does help with being physical and being just a bully out there on the ice. But he's also very good on the penalty kill. So he helps out there. And then you go get Jacob Loco from the Boston Bruins. And he's a young guy, but he hits like a maniac. And so Bill Guerin did help the identity. My only question about that is it feels like the Wild have a bunch of those types of guys. And if it were me, I would have hoped that those guys could supply more of the bite, more of the fight than they did over the last couple of seasons, as opposed to going out and getting another guy to add to that mix.
Right.
Trenin won't help because he will. It's just, I would have liked to have seen, that relied upon within based off the guys the Wild had. But beyond that, a ton of depth added to the organization, a bunch of 2-way contracts. That was a key too, is the Wild just had no depth last year to handle injuries. And so now you've got some guys who have NHL experience that will most likely be down in Iowa. If you suffer an injury, need to make a call up, they'll be near the top of the list, and they can at least come in and just kind of right the ship. But it's like when you're grocery shopping on a budget. You got your list, and it's like, hey, don't deviate from this list. Get specifically what we have written on here, and Bill Guerin did that.
So now that Bill Guerin has checked a lot of things off the list, what is your biggest concern? Here we are a month out roughly from the start of training camp.
Secondary scoring is the biggest thing for me, assuming that the Minnesota Wild keep the combination of Joel Eriksson Ek, Matt Boldy, and Kirill Kaprizov, which was among, if not the best line combination in the entire NHL once they came together. If John Hines elects to keep that group intact to start the season, it's going to be on the second line, which will be Marco Rossi, Matt Zuccarello, and there's a big question mark in that wing spot on that second line. Will it be rookie Liam Ogren who handles that spot? That remains to be seen. Will it be Marcus Johansson, who, quite honestly, he did not perform as to what you would expect from a second line guy in that spot last season? Will he be given another opportunity there? That's going to be a really critical thing for the Wild to determine who gets that spot, because we saw it down the stretch last year against the teams above them in the playoff chase. If you can slow down Kaprizov, Boldy, and Eriksson Ek enough, and that second line can't cut it, that's a pretty easy recipe to put the Minnesota Wild in the L column. So that second line wing spot is going to be really key. The other things that I'm really interested to see how they play out, considering the moves that were made, is what the special teams units look like. Who's going to be on that top power play? It's been pretty heavy in the past of Kaprizov, Zuccarello, Boldy, Eriksson Ek, and probably Brock Faber or Jared Spurgeon. What does that penalty kill unit look like? Yakov Trennin's going to be in the mix. Do you put him and Joel Eriksson Ek on that top unit? And then, Spurgeon, Brodin. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, and schematically if we see any differences in that unit, because it was a sieve last year. They were operating most of the season at about 61%, and quite frankly, I'm surprised that they got it higher than that, because it seemed like every time another team went on the power play, it was just throw the puck in the net and be done with it. So that's going to be a real key for this team. If they want to get into the postseason this year, it's going to be secondary scoring and special teams that are going to massively decide if that happens or not.
All right. Well, I know you'll keep a pulse on this all season long and all year long. Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Make sure to check out Locked On Wild on all your favorite social accounts. Now that we are in August and moving to closer to the 2024-2025 season, we're going to be bringing you more social media presence to kind of gear you up for what is to come this year. And you can, of course, also follow me on X at Seth Toups for all your favorite Minnesota sports takes, because let's be honest, Minnesota sports give me plenty to talk about in addition to the Minnesota Wild. So come out and have some fun. And most importantly, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Wild.
All right, Seth, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure, Gil.
Thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. Now go check out Locked On NHL Prospects, where you can have year-round coverage of the top prospects in the world of hockey and some young NHL players as well. You can find the link to Locked On NHL Prospects in the description. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank my guest, Seth Tuple of Locked On Wild, Laura Saba of Locked On Canadiens, and of course, Eddie Garcia of Locked On LA Kings. I am Gil Martin. I'm here every Monday hosting Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. We are here every Monday through Friday bringing you the top stories from around the league, so make sure you join us for that. Until then, have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.